right, so this is a supplemental review session. Ashley Hampton, our tutor, had some questions, and we thought we'd go over them together and record them so she would be ready for the extra tutoring that people have requested. And we thought, well, we may as well just record it so anyone who wants to listen can. So Ashley, your first question was on Section 8, number 20. What was the state of the Army following the rise of a militarized government? What were its weaknesses? So looking at Section 8, let's see. If you are looking at the Section 8 PowerPoint, it's going to take me a second to actually get there. There is a slide that says Rise of Militarized Government. So you can do the Edit Find command to find that. So the Army here, let's see. Okay, so we're actually on the slide that has, it says militarized government, and there's a picture of a tank. So one thing, even you now have this government where the military has come into more power in 1935, and the military actually faces some serious issues. In 1935, along the Manchurian border, remember Japan has seized control of Manchuria, so it's now responsible for security there. The Soviet Union has three infantry divisions for every one Japanese division, so there's 3-to-1 advantage for the Soviets there. And for every one Japanese aircraft, there are 5 Soviet aircraft. So Japan is, the militarized government wants to build up its military because it's nowhere near the size of that of the Soviet Union. In 1936, the Washington Naval Treaty will expire, and Japan does not want to renew that treaty. So that means that they are, and remember that was an arms limitation treaty. So that treaty prevented Japan from building a lot of battleships and other naval vessels. But now Japan, now that it expires, it's going to build those, just engage in arms buildup. So the military is going to expand a great deal. And so thus in 1937, military would take up 3/4 of the budget of Japan, up from 1/3 in 1930. So this is very serious military buildup. Then looking at the next slide that says Rise of Militarized Government, has a picture of Uncle Sam shaking hands with a representative of the Chinese nationalists. And the problem that the Japanese have is they can't build enough artillery, tanks, trucks, and aircraft at the same time. They can't build enough ships at the same time. This idea that they can somehow keep up with the Soviet Union and the United States while preparing for a war, in a sense, with China is just impossible. They can't do it. Now they try. They establish cartels and trusts. They essentially are regulating capitalism in order to maximize efficiency so they can produce as many military goods as possible. But again, there's a big problem here because, you know, they're building up their military, which will probably fight in China, but they rely on China for materials. So they're getting ready to attack a major trading partner. Similarly, they rely on the U.S. for a lot of manufactured goods. A lot of their advanced technology and weapons are produced by the Americans, and they're getting ready to possibly fight us. So they're going to war against the people who produce things they need and whose materials they need in order to go to war. It's a terrible paradox, right? And again, what's really weird is that, remember, they're not going to end up fighting the Soviet Union until very late. Like, they only fight the Soviet Union for a few days before they surrender. But all this is being done to prepare to fight the Soviet Union, right? So it's this really bizarre situation. And what they're going to do, and this is leading up to the Marco Polo incident, which I covered in the other review session, Japan is going to increasingly push south from Manchuria with its army to gain more and more informal control over Chinese territory. And that decision is what leads it to war with China and then the United States, which of course is then, and it leads to this bizarre situation where they end up fighting all these other countries except for the Soviet Union, which was their main enemy. So any questions there, Ashley? Did that all make sense?
That makes sense.
So you had this other question: how and why did full-scale war with China break out in 1937? I actually cover that in the other review session. Okay. I noted, but just if people are listening to this, I'll just point out it basically is an escalation of the Marco Polo incident. Okay. Japan and China both have troops on, this is in northern China, they both have troops on either side of this bridge. Fighting breaks out. In the past, they would have come up with some way to kind of negotiate some sort of ceasefire. In this case, neither party wants to back down. The Chinese are tired of this because each time this happens, the Japanese use it as an excuse to expand their power. And Japan wants to use this incident as an excuse to expand its power and to kind of settle outstanding issues, especially the trying to get China to recognize Manchuria as an independent country. And it doesn't work, and this then just develops into a full-scale war because both sides have irreconcilable differences. Japan wants to expand its influence more in China. China says, we're sick of it. And so it's going to now lead to fighting.
Okay, I was just confused on whether or not they had declared a ceasefire after that incident or not.
I think they maybe did for a bit, and then it broke down. Negotiations broke down. The key thing for us is that they weren't able to create a long-lasting peace after this, rather than it going its usual kind of pattern was there's an incident, Japan uses that and its greater power to expand against China in the wake of the incident, but this time the incident, rather than just leading to a peaceful expansion of Japanese power, leads to a violent war. So that takes care of that. And that also takes care of 25, right? What was the Marco Polo incident? How did it come to lead to war? What did the purpose of the war start off as? What did it become?
Yeah,
what did it foreshadow?
I was kind of confused about the trail of events, that kind of started off the incident itself, because I know it broke out over a bridge, on top of a bridge on the Marco Polo, was it?
Right, what's called the Marco Polo Bridge.
Yeah, the Marco Polo Bridge.
And we don't go into the detail because it's not as the significance of the incident, because there were lots of incidents like this. So the significance of the incidents is just the fact that neither side backs down, and this leads to then this kind of full-scale war. But so we're on question 25. What did the purpose of the war start off as? The war started off mostly as Japan just wanting to get to expand its influence, to resolve some outstanding issues, particularly trying to get China to recognize Manchuria as independent, right? Which means that basically China would say, well, no, this is no longer part of our territory. We withdraw those claims, and then Japan could influence Manchuria however it wanted. It's going to quickly become a full-scale war, which the Japanese will understand as a holy war meant to spread the imperial way and the emperor's benevolence, right? So it will go from just a small incident to this major war. And the foreshadowing just has to do with the fact that the Japanese will attack an American ship. There's an American ship called the Panay that is clearly flying U.S. colors in China, but Japanese pilots will attack it and sink it. Now, the Japanese government does pay us restitution and apologize, but the key point here is that there were Japanese who wanted war with the United States, even in 1937, who would like that. And that's, what that pilot was doing. The pilot knew full well that this was an American ship. It was clearly marked as such. So that's foreshadowing eventual war with the Americans. So we had this next question, question 28. What was the military situation Japan faced in 1938? Why? How did it try and deal with the situation? So the basic thing, and I'm looking at the slide that says 1938 stalemate at the top, and the problem was, and I kept highlighting this, the Soviet Union was supposed to be the main enemy of Japan, and they're not fighting the Soviet Union, right? And this is their frustration, is they want to end that war in China as soon as possible, because the whole point of fighting with China is to get resources so that they can resist the Soviet Union. But the problem was China, even though Japan is able to win these battles, China was just too big to swallow, right? As the Japanese could consistently defeat the Chinese in battle, but the Chinese followed a strategy of trading space for time. They would withdraw rather than fight a decisive battle. The Chinese knew that Japan was limited in its ability to fight a long war. So because the Chinese knew that limitation, they refused to give in. They refused to fight a short, decisive war. They would not risk major battles as much as possible. And this is a new China, so even though China has lost Shanghai, its economic and cultural capital, even though it's lost Nanjing, its political capital, they still keep fighting. They just moved to Chongqing, another capital the Japanese cannot reach. And the Japanese just have these outrageous demands for a ceasefire. They want China to recognize Manchukuo as an independent country. They say we want to help you destroy communism because there is an active communist movement in China, but the Japanese want to station their troops in China, and this is clearly just an excuse so they can put their troops anywhere they want to in China. And they also want to make sure to gain access to China's natural resources. The Chinese refuse this. They say, no, this is crazy. You're basically wanting to make us a colony, and this is us surrendering, essentially, to you. So Japan responds by saying it will no longer negotiate with the Chinese nationalist government, and instead establishes a puppet government to negotiate with, to kind of add this veneer of legality. So Japan, in a short 4 question, right? How did it try and deal with the situation? Like I just said, it just says, well, we're no longer going to negotiate with the Chinese nationalist government. We're just going to create this puppet government. But also, the Japanese will use basically brutality. There's this idea that the only way now we need to just convince the Chinese that it would be easier to give up than to keep fighting with us. We're going to be brutal. So this is where you have them engage in terror bombing, biological and chemical warfare, and other things. So brutality, atrocity has become basically military policy. So do you have any additional questions? I think I answered everything on Section 8 that you had highlighted.
Okay, so one of my tutorees, she had I want to make sure I was telling her right about the 1936 film. So back during 17,
right,
about how the Japanese see itself threatened in the cartoon as 1936. I kind of told her how basically it's showing how the Japanese view themselves against the Western world. They're kind of tired of proving themselves up to like Western standards and everything, and how they're saying if basically the Westerners engage with them in warfare or any kind of like, in a sense, they're going to defend themselves and attack. And I guess I kind of said also too, it was kind of like showing their characteristics of Pan-Asianism, of like protecting themselves and other Asians too, like protecting kind of like the great East Asian prosperity spirit, like how they're protecting themselves and like other nations and everything. And
I think I would just add to that, the big thing, remember they were just sitting there singing and dancing when the Americans, evil Mickey comes and attacks them. Yeah. And it's this idea we are on the defensive.
Yeah.
Other people threaten us and we have to defend ourselves. But yeah, I think your explanation was very good, and I would just add that. Okay.
Yeah. I did say that the U.S. kind of did seem like bullies in that and everything. Mickey Mouse was kind of bullied.
Oh yeah, well, I mean very much so. We were. All right, so that brings us then to Section 9. So question 3, there was this question, why did Japan expand into Vietnam? And basically it was to gain access to more natural resources. Vietnam has a lot of rice, which was needed to feed troops, has some other resources, but also it gave Japan a base to expand into Indonesia, which of course has a lot of rubber and other natural resources, and Malaysia, which most importantly has oil. And the question asked here was, how did the U.S. react? We reacted by demanding that Japan withdraw not only from Vietnam, but withdraw from all of China. And we said, if you do not do this, we will stop selling you oil. Right. So, and that was serious because we traded with Japan about 80% of their oil came from the United States.
Okay, so about the negotiations with the to the stalling. So do we need to know exactly details about the negotiations that the U.S. were making and everything, or?
Oh, just that they failed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the negotiations failed.
Okay.
Yeah. So then the next question was, well, I guess real quickly, why did this lead to war? Well, Japan was in this position where if they withdrew from China, which was unrealistic, that they would just withdraw after losing that many people. I mean, you're just going to withdraw, especially with a militarized government, when someone asks you to, right? But they said, if we withdraw from China, then we still have that same basic problem. Where are we going to get the resources that we think are necessary in order to maintain and defend our independence, maintain and defend our empire? So they said, if we withdraw, we're going to be doomed anyway. So we might as well just go ahead and launch an attack. And see, and hopefully we can replay the Russo-Japanese War, that we can make it difficult enough for the Americans that they will negotiate a favorable peace. I like to point out the fact that they launched a surprise attack meant we were not interested in negotiations, and we're not Russia. Russia was a weak industrial power. The United States was the strongest industrial power in the world at the time, so it was not the same situation. Oh, and I'm sorry, I was asking number 3. How was Japan's attack at Pearl Harbor and its overall strategy against the Allied powers similar to what did it during the Russo-Japanese War? That's the same thing. And why would it fail? Exactly what I just said, right? It was trying to replay the Russo-Japanese War, inflict maximum damage, make it too expensive to keep fighting, so that you would negotiate a peace that was favorable to Japan. And it fails because they, like I said, it was a surprise attack. The Americans were angry, and the Americans just had a much stronger industrial base and were politically stable, whereas Russia in 1904 was not politically stable. It had a weak industrial base. Question 12, how were Korean people mobilized? I'll do this one really quickly because I did it in the other review I recorded. But basically, Koreans often became laborers during World War II. Some of them were voluntary, some of them were not, some of them were forced to become laborers. There were also Koreans who volunteered to fight in the war, that were willing to fight for the Japanese. Most were not, but there were enough that someone wrote a book about it, that there were enough who were willing to fight. There were even some Korean kamikazes. And also we talked about this very, disgusting or distasteful, I'm not sure, it's hard to think of a good word, but of these women, Korean women, but this included also Filipinos, Chinese, even some Western women, Dutch women, who were forced to have sex with soldiers. And this was organized by the government. These women had no choice. They were not paid. They were just forced to have sex with soldiers. And like I say, a lot of Korean women had this happen to them, and this is a big issue between Japan and Korea today. What were the characteristics of Japan's home front? Again, this is one that I went over in the other review, so I'll just talk about very quickly. Remember, in Japan, there is no Rosie the Riveter. Married women were not to work in factories for the most part. Young women did. Right, young women worked in factories, but Japan was such a patriarchal system that there was still, even in this wartime situation where labor was scarce, a woman's place, or I should say a mother's place, was in the home. Unmarried women without children are a little bit different. They can go out and work, but once you're married and have kids, you need to be there raising your children. And we also talked about how, I gave you this example, this advertising, where this toothpaste promised to give you the best smile in the greater Asian co-prosperity sphere, right? So, and then we also talked about how the fact that even in this time period of the war, I showed advertisements of Western women, right? So you still had this idea of Western women as setting a standard of beauty. There's a woman with blue eyes who's clearly a Westerner. There's this other one of this woman combing her hair that says, if you clean your hair, you will have a clean heart. And it's clearly a Western woman who's doing this. You can tell by her nose. And I also gave the example of perms, right? That the Japanese government tried to ban perms, but Japanese women liked them and would continue to wear them. So that gives you some idea. But like I said, I go into more detail in the other one. And the last question you had was, what was the Potsdam Declaration? How did the Japanese leader respond to it? What were Hirohito's concerns? So the Potsdam Declaration, first of all, this is one by the Allies. This is the Allies saying to Japan, particularly Truman, saying, if you do not surrender, a rain of ruin will come from your skies. We have this new powerful weapon, so you need to surrender. And the Japanese respond by doing nothing, right? So you have this kind of threat that we will destroy you if you do not give up, and the Japanese do nothing. Hirohito's concern, remember,
was with his relics and preserving the emperors.
Yeah, the regalia, the jewel, the mirror, and the sword, which are symbols of his office. And his big fear is preserving his position, the institution of the emperorship, this imperial institution. Because remember, in this time period, for the people were not the nation, the emperor is the nation, right? The emperor is the state, he's the nation, he's everything. So it's okay to sacrifice a lot of Japanese people to protect the emperor. That's why it was such a big deal in the 1947 Constitution that the Americans wrote that said the emperor is just a symbol of the people. He's not the people, and you can't just kill all these people to protect the emperor.
So basically tell, like, Annie or somebody that the Japanese generals, the admirals, and along with Hirohito kind of respond with this as a bluff. They take it as a bluff from
the civilian ministers too. The civilian cabinet. It's not just the military. Okay. It's only after the atomic bombs are dropped and after Russia declares war that the civilians tend to be a little bit stronger. There were some civilian resistance to it, but even a lot of the civilian officials were like, the Americans are just bluffing. They're just trying to scare us into surrendering.
And then I also told her for like the characteristics of Japan's home front, like the Ketsugo and them teaching kendo. So is that something that?
Well, that's not what I was thinking of with that question, but it's certainly something that could appear on the test. So, I mean, you raise a good point. So Ketsugo was basically, remember this strategy, every Japanese person is going to be a kind of kamikaze. And I've got that picture of the young girls training with bamboo spears. We can all... what's guiding it is this idea that the emperor is the nation. We have to protect the emperor at all costs. And it's interesting that the emperor's major fear was not, oh my gosh, this is sad, all these people may die. His fear is, I don't know if they can handle this, they may rebel. And that's ultimately why the emperor does vote to surrender, because he's more afraid of his own people rebelling against him than he is of the Americans by that time. So any other questions on Section 9 before we go forward to Section 10? All right, so Section 10.
One question.
Sure.
So the Nomonhan incident, Nomonhan?
Nomonhan Han, yeah.
Yes. Could you elaborate on that term a little bit more? I know that had to do with, was that one of the treaties and pacts that the Soviet Union and Nazi?
Okay, so Nomonhan's a place, and we use it, it's like the Battle of Gettysburg, it's a place, so we say the Battle of Nomonhan. Mm-hmm. And the key thing about Nomonhan is it's fought in 1939, and it's this, it's a border dispute between the Soviet Union and Japan. And the key thing I wanted, there's several key things to know about it, was that the Soviet Union just absolutely walks over the Japanese forces, no problem. And this it's because of their technology. They had these very advanced tanks. The Japanese had very few tanks. The tanks they had are classified as tankettes, meaning extraordinarily light tanks. So the Japanese were just technologically outclassed by the Soviet Union. And so this should have been a wake-up call. Maybe we need to not be so aggressive and so belligerent because our army, our military is outclassed by other people. We would probably lose a war. But instead, the Japanese commanders blamed their soldiers and said, well, the men were just not sufficiently spirited enough. So that's one key thing to get out of this. This was a learning opportunity for the Japanese officers, but as they often did, they just blamed their soldiers rather than saying, maybe our plan is bad. And also the problem is, this gets the Japanese to say, okay, we can't really, the Soviets are hard, maybe we should focus on expanding south into the islands, which would be war against the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. And while Japan is doing that, Germany signs a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, which convinces the Japanese, okay, we really don't want to fight the Soviets at this time. But Germany didn't bother to tell Japan that it was going to invade the Soviet Union later. And what would have made sense was if Germany would have told the Japanese that, they would have planned on attacking the Soviet Union. They could have opened up two fronts on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union could have lost then, right? That would have been very difficult. But they didn't. And this meant that Japan, instead of helping the Germans against the Soviet Union, would instead get the United States in the war against both Japan and Nazi Germany. And it's that kind of diplomatic dance that Nomonhan plays a part of. So any other questions about Section 9 before we move forward? So Section 10. So you had a question about number 4 on Section 10. What contrasting images do Japanese people have of Americans? And I was thinking in particular of that video we watched, Barefoot Gen, where, remember there's the two brothers, and the one brother wants the chocolate, and is willing to kind of beg for the chocolate and so forth and fight for it with other Japanese people. And the other brother is saying, why would you do this? These Americans are the ones that killed our family by dropping the atomic bomb. And so I just wanted people to kind of understand this complex image that Japanese could have of Americans. We were wealthy, we were powerful, we were relatively friendly, right? The American soldiers aren't bad people in that video. They smile at the Japanese kids and they give them chocolate. But there's still this power differential between us, and we still have this very negative history between us. And so on that same slide, it says Scapp and Douglas MacArthur. So the Americans, when we looked at Japanese society, this is question 5, our major question was, what was the cause of Japanese militarism? Why did Japan engage in this aggressive war? And we said it arose from the elites having a monopoly on power, resulting in tyranny, the destruction of democracy, and poverty. And a lot of this had to do with the military elite, right? These people were able to get power. So our solution was to democratize Japan and to demilitarize Japan. And that's a lot of the reverse course is us saying, oops, we weren't so happy about this demilitarization. We weren't thinking of the Cold War in 1945 when we did all this stuff. So we're going to try and get rid of this. We get rid of the thought police. We release communists from jail. This is before the reverse course, before the Cold War becomes big. We disestablish Shinto, right? Shinto can no longer be supported by the government. And the United States shortly declares that Japan will enjoy freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and allow union activity legally. And there also are some land reforms. So basically what the Americans do is we force Japanese people who own over a certain amount of land to sell that land at low prices. So that this leads to many people being able to buy land. And so that basically we wanted to destroy that elite landlord class, and we did that by forcing them to sell their land at very low prices. Now, there are some ambiguities. We talked about this idea of freedom of speech, but remember, we had the Japanese kids censor their own textbooks, which creates some complexities. I mean, there were reasons. I mean, that was a problem. We wanted to censor anything that had to do with militarization, which runs into the problem of freedom of speech. And that was the kind of ambiguity. So why were the American bases controversial? That's question 11. That was the next one. And that is on the slide that says Security Treaty Revision Talks, 1959. Has a nice mugshot of Kishi Nobusuke. There we go. So they're controversial because on one side, first of all, locally, a lot of people, I mean, having a military base is good for business. You make a lot of money off American soldiers. They're wealthy. They have discretionary income. You can make a lot of money. But of course, also you have then bars, brothels, young men going out getting drunk, starting fights, things like that. So some Japanese people who live in the area support bases because they make money off it. Others oppose the bases. Similarly, internationally, there's this question, is being close to the United States good for Japan, or does it make Japan a target? So basically, the conservatives said that, well, we want to form this close alliance with the United States because they will provide our security, so that and then we can focus on rebuilding our economy. But the progressives, the liberals, say no. Being close to the United States makes us an enemy of communism, and then the communists might target us. And if there's a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. Oh, Richard, go ahead and come in. I can go ahead and take your exam. Sorry, you're fine. Thank you. So if there's a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States, and we're allied with the United States, we may get hit by nuclear weapons. On the other hand, if we're neutral, they'll just leave us alone. So that's why it's kind of controversial, right? And both sides end up being logical. In the end, the conservatives end up being right, at least internationally. Okay. That being part of the American security umbrella is beneficial to Japan's economic recovery.
I had a question right before that I guess I forgot to highlight. It was number 7 about what was the reverse course.
Okay. So you remember how I was just talking about how the U.S. was like releasing communists from and was saying that Japan should not be militarized and things like that? Mm-hmm. And if you're looking at the study guide, this is question 7. The reverse course is saying, oh, we don't want to do that anymore. Basically, this is pre-Cold War, right? The Cold War doesn't begin immediately in 1945. Mm-hmm. So that's why we took this kind of policy of releasing communists from jail and so forth. But the rising fears of communism are going to lead Americans to say, oh, we shouldn't have done this. So they're going to scale back on attempts to dissolve the Zaibatsu. These business conglomerates. The labor laws will be revised so they're not so lenient, so they're not so worker friendly. And the United States, which did not want a national police force in Japan because that had been used to abuse power and put down democratic dissent. Now we want a national police force so we can keep track of communists. And in 1949 in particular, that's when the communists win the Chinese Civil War. And so 1950, the same year, of course, that the Korean War starts, the United States will launch a Red Purge where we tell the Japanese government that basically that there's 24 communists who are in high positions of government who are a danger to democracy. They need to be fired. They need to be removed from their positions of power. The Japanese government does that, but then it goes ahead and fires a bunch more communists because the conservatives are in charge of the government. They don't like the communists. And this will even extend into the private sector. And what's interesting is that conservatives who have been purged after World War II, some of them are rehabilitated and allowed to become engaged in military activity. So even former war criminals, as long as they're anti-communist and their crimes weren't considered too bad, will say, okay, you guys can come back into politics. Right, so this is a reverse course, this becoming less progressive, more conservative because of this fear of communism that arises, especially, like I said, about 1947. And that's usually the year we know. And that's also where the United States kind of regretted the whole demilitarization thing. We're like, oh, we wish we could have remilitarized Japan, especially after we lose China to the communists. So that brings us then to question 13. Who was Asanuma Inejiro? And so he's that poor leader of the socialists, There he appears in 1960 in a photo with Chairman Mao Zedong of China and declares that American imperialism is the common enemy of the Chinese and Japanese people. So he's clearly one of these people who thinks that the military alliance is bad for Japan, right? He doesn't want the U.S. around, and he's assassinated on live TV. And this has kind of two interesting consequences. The one issue is that it leads to the crumbling of the left, and they just get destroyed in that 1960 movement, in 1960 elections, because one of their major leaders just got killed. A lot of them are intimidated. They're confused about what they should do. So that allows the conservatives, the Liberal Democratic Party, to take power. And it is confusing because in English, when we say Liberal Democratic, you would think the left, but they're the conservatives. They take power. But the other consequences, they say, whoa, this seems a lot like the 1930s, and we know what that led to. So instead of saying, okay, we're in power now, let's just do everything we want to, they actually become more moderate. That they say, this is bad, we don't want this situation, and so they try and find a middle ground, and that middle ground ends up being economic development. So one thing a lot of conservatives wanted to do originally was they wanted to get rid of Article 9. Conservatives hated that. They wanted to remilitarize. But at this point they say, this is just too polarizing an issue. We're not saying we're never going to do it, but we're not going to try and do it now. We're going to back off on this, and we're going to focus on economic recovery. And that worked. Basically, was that this was something Japanese people could get behind. It found a broad consensus. And so it's this kind of interesting thing was that, this is, I think, a great moment in Japanese political history, that they decided to back away and seek consensus and moderation rather than just saying, okay, we win, let's do whatever we want. It's just sad that it took the death of poor Asanuma in a Jiro to get people to say, let's back off.
And just out of curiosity, who was the guy that had assassinated him? Was he on the liberal?
Oh no, he was a right-wing conservative. He was 18, I believe, very young man, and angry at what he saw. I think he followed the kind of 1930s ideology. Incidentally, he actually he was put in jail. Was supposed to go on trial for murder, but he committed suicide in jail as a kind of protest, like a traditional samurai would have done. I think he did it with dental floss. Like, it was this very, like, he strangled himself with dental floss. It was this very bizarre incident. So the next question, 14, was what were the characteristics of one-party democracy? How did the politics of compromise influence economic life? I won't talk about that on the exam because we ended up not going over that. But just if you're curious, basically the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, has just run Japan forever. They've only rarely, I think there's only one brief period where the prime minister was not a member of the Liberal Democratic Party. Like, the socialists won one time, and they're still in power. And so it's this interesting case because it is usually when you think one-party government, you think of like a communist country or Nazi Germany. And Japan is a one-party democracy. So they actually are a functioning democracy, but one where just this party has done such a good job at compromising that it always wins. On the national level, local level, communists and socialists can win elections, but the prime minister, except for I think one time, has always been Liberal Democratic Party. But the other question, how did the politics of compromise influence economic life? Like we just talked about, the Japanese government just says, let's focus on the economy. Let's get people wealthy. That's what they want. And let's stop getting into these divisive things. Question 17, how did the state work with business? What results did the cooperation bring? How did the U.S. react? And so I'm looking at the slide, state and economy. Basically, through instruments like MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, the government will seek to guide economic development. They'll have 5-year plans, but this isn't a command economy. The Japanese government does not tell the business leaders what to do, but it will say, we need to develop our steel industry, and we're willing to give loans and subsidies and tax breaks to any business that wants to do that. And so they're guiding industry rather than telling them what to do. Now, what results did the cooperation bring? Massive economic growth. Like, this was really successful. This worked really well. How did the U.S. react? The U.S. did not like this because what Japan did was it set up tariffs, it set up protectionism, where essentially Japan's market was mostly closed to foreign goods, whereas the American market was open to Japanese goods. And we would complain and gripe about it, but the Japanese would say, well, we want our economy to keep developing to show that capitalism is better than communism, right? We're in the Cold War, and if you were to stop us from selling our goods freely in the United States, if we were to open our markets to American goods, that would hurt our economy, and that would hurt the cause of capitalism and liberal democracy. So for political reasons, the Americans sacrificed our economic interests, and we allowed Japan to kind of engage in what were, frankly speaking, these kind of unfair trade practices. But it did work. Japan becomes wealthy and an important player in the Cold War. Question 19, how did economic recovery and development influence Japanese life? What were the 3 imperial regalia and the 3 C's? And I won't go into all the details, but basically we have an increase in homogeneity in Japanese people. So whereas before there were big differences between the countryside and the city, big differences between the rich and the poor, those differences are becoming smoothed out. More and more people live in Japanese cities, and even if you don't live in the city, it's easy to travel there. Most Japanese start living in nuclear families. Most Japanese children are born by 1975 in their homes. In hospitals rather than at homes. This had been the norm in 1955. And so more and more Japanese people are living almost identical lives in many respects. And when that happens, that reduces a lot of conflict in many ways. And part of this was this growing consumer culture where Japanese people got great things. So I'm looking at this slide that says Rise of Consumer Culture. So by the mid-1950s, there were what they called the 3 imperial regalia, right? We talked about that earlier, the jewel, the mirror, and the sword. But in this case, it refers to a washing machine, fridge, and black and white TV. And these became kind of, aspirational norms. These were things Japanese people wanted, but could eventually afford. In the 1970s, the country got so wealthy, or by 1960s, is now the 3 C's: car, cooler, that's an air conditioner, and color TV. And so most Japanese by 1970s had identified themselves as middle class. They could afford these things. It was normal for Japanese people to own them. We had this question, 21, what was the Michiko boom? So remember, Michiko is the woman who will marry the crown prince, Akihito. And Michiko was a commoner. She was a high-class commoner, but she was a commoner. And their match was essentially a love match. They actually kind of dated. It was a pre-selected group. It wasn't like that I said the emperor was not hanging around in bars trying to pick up girls or anything like that. It would have been funny. If he did, but he didn't. These were all introductions, but this was something that they had to do this. The emperor kind of dated, and it's significant because it shows that the emperor is becoming more democratic. Right, he's becoming closer to the people. Hirohito could not mix with his people at all. He had no idea how to do it. He hadn't been raised to do it. He'd been raised to be a living god. Akihito was fine with that. He was quite comfortable in the camera, quite comfortable dealing with people. I think today he actually abdicated. I think Eiko mentioned that in class. He actually formally gave up the throne today because he's older and he wants a younger person, his younger son, to take over. But also it's led to a transformation in television because lots of Japanese people now have money and they want to buy a TV to watch them get married. And I thought that was kind of interesting because once they're married, they still got the TVs. And that's when, I didn't mention in class was aside, that's when Astro Boy comes out. Right, now that they have TVs, you can start having television anime. The last slide was Yukio Mishima that you asked about. He is not on the exam. Oh, okay. I will just mention, if you're a literary person, he is an important and fascinating literary figure. He wrote a lot of stuff about suicide and then ended up trying to convince the Japanese army to rise up against the Japanese government and stage a coup, and that failed, and then he committed suicide. So it's this very fascinating story. I wish we had time to talk about Yukio Mishima, but I ended up deciding it was fine just to end with Godzilla because it represented, now Japan has recovered, has become a cultural force on a global stage, and that's probably a nicer place to stop than some poor guy fantasizing about suicide and then finally committing suicide. Just as a quick aside, he and Michiko, I guess, had engaged in serious talks about getting married. And then she ended up marrying the emperor, and I think she had a happier life marrying the emperor with the other person. Yukio Mishima is not someone that you would, I think, have a happy married life with.
Yeah.
So before we stop, any other questions?
Just one. So back on number 6.
Right.
One of my tutors wanted me to elaborate about how exactly Japanese did this come from Article 9 about how Japanese people were still able to shape their government and societies about American power? Is that an example of it? Because the fact that they are able to declare war.
Oh no, we totally wrote that. The key thing, what I just wanted people to understand was that even though the United States, we can tell Japan, this is your new constitution. They have to implement it. And they can just ignore stuff, right? I mean, people, I can't think, you're a parent, you're a kid, your parent tells you to do something. Sometimes you do it, sometimes you don't, right? Because your parent can't be everywhere at once. Now imagine if you spoke a language your parents couldn't speak. You'd be more able to do that even more easily. So even though the Americans, we can dictate things at the top, the Japanese are the ones that implement it. And there's just not enough Americans that speak Japanese to make sure they're doing everything that we want them to do. So things that are kind of unpopular, like getting rid of the zaibatsu, just fail. We just fail to do that. We don't succeed in getting rid of these big business conglomerates. Women's rights, totally popular. The Japanese people, at least Japanese women, like that. That's totally popular. It stays. So whatever we try to do, and that's what's complex about that Constitution. We forced the Japanese to accept it, but a lot of them were quite happy with it. They were very happy with it, and they haven't. I mean, I think they maybe made some amendments, but the Constitution's still there. Other things that we tried to do that were not popular failed, because the Japanese could just hide it, and then we left. Well, we're not completely left, but the occupation government is gone. The soldiers are still there.
Okay. Number 8, about the characteristics of the 1951 treaty. I wanted to kind of elaborate more to explain about how they were unequal and a bad thing.
Well, so we went through the language of the 1951 treaty, which is basically like giving the United States the ability to intervene in Japan if it should face either internal unrest or external invasion. And that's kind of extreme, right? Especially the external thing I can kind of see, because that's like an alliance. But the internal thing, like if someone should rebel against the Japanese government, we're allowed to send troops. Now, the Japanese government had to request it. Yeah. But, so that's one aspect. And the other aspect, Article 2 says basically, no one else gets these rights, just the United States, right? So no other country can have these same rights. Soviet Union was the target of this, I think. So this is an unequal treaty because the Japanese don't have those rights in the United States. Japan, there's nothing that says that Japan has to send troops if we request them. So it's an unequal treaty. Definitely, it's totally unequal. And that's why I use this image, right, of the American shark protecting the little Japanese fish against the communist redfish, who are, that was a very clever artist who made that, I think. And the question, was that a bad thing? Was that some conservatives says this is terrible, this is shameful for us Japanese to do this. A lot of progressives did not like this either because they thought being close to the United States was dangerous for Japan. And of course, we did just get done bombing them. So you can see there's kind of an emotional thing. Wait, these guys are guaranteeing our security, the people that attack, were fighting us.
But Shigeru was the one that said use it for benefit.
Right, Yoshida Shigeru said, no, this is a good thing because this means that we won't have to spend money on our own security. We can deal with it. We can focus on our economy. And remember, I gave the example. I mean, this guy was brilliant because whenever the Americans would try and pressure Japan, he would just leak information and tell his socialist doctor, oh, the Americans are trying to get us to pay more money for these bases. And then his doctor would inform the Socialist Party, and they would have a big protest. And Yoshida Shigeru would say, oh, my hands are tied. We're a democracy now. The people clearly don't want this. So, I have to represent the will of the people, being a good believer in democracy. And he was a believer in democracy, though he was a very conservative one. But the guy was a genius. And fascinating man.
You made me like him too, and everything. Oh, yeah. He's a really good politician.
Right, yeah. So, any other questions? Or?
I don't necessarily... Oh, wait, okay. Could you kind of elaborate a little bit more about the characteristics of the protests from the 1950s? That's basically my last question. Oh,
so the protests in the 1950s were the progressives protesting what the conservatives were trying to do. The conservatives are going to control the government, the Diet, but the progressives are there, and they're protesting. And I gave this example in 1958 of the police duties law, which is this thing Kishi Nobusuke is pushing forward, which would basically give the Japanese law the Japanese police law the powers they had back in the 30s. And a lot of people don't like that, especially these progressive groups who suffered at the hands of the Japanese police in the 30s. And they launch massive protests, and they force this bill they lead to this bill dying, to being defeated. Mm-hmm. And so that emboldened them, so that when the Kishi negotiates in 1959 the Security Treaty revision, they're very upset about this for reasons we've already discussed, and they will actually then unite to protest against that. We watched the video about that, and I showed you a lot of pictures. Remember, they try to actually barricade the Diet speaker so they can't actually have the vote, right? So the protests are very raucous, they're very powerful. In the end, they lose out. The peace treaty is passed. The security treaty is revised successfully, which they didn't want, but Kishi Nobusuke is forced to resign in its wake. Though again, his party stays in power, even though he himself is personally defeated.
Okay. All right, and he also advocated for the police reform duty laws.
Yeah,
which
that's
was the one
right.
that mirrored the
Like the 1930s, it
yeah.
would have made pretty much bring back like the thought police and stuff
Yeah.
like that.
Okay. But he was still part of the LPD, well, the LDP.
Yeah,
like
right.
The Liberal Democratic Party. Okay.
Right, right.
Alrighty. Alright.
Good deal.
Alright, good deal.
All right. Well, thank you, Ashley. I hope this is beneficial. Thank you for bringing these questions, for your hard work as a tutor for our students.